BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. On Mondays, I talk to you guys about the Zodiac Killer, an unidentified serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, I frequently tell you guys that I like challenge questions. I will respond to almost any challenge question under the sun or in the darkness. So on this episode of Zodiac Monday, I will be looking at several different challenge questions that you guys have left in the comments section, as well as some that are on other Zodiac-related videos. And the first one comes to us from Time Theory, who tuned in to the episode of True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. That's the Thursday show here on BBOR. And Time Theory said that, dang, I missed it. I had a question I wanted to ask. So I simply said, well, you can ask it here and I can answer on the next Zodiac Monday. This is an ongoing set of discussions that we have about not only the Zodiac Killer, but other true crime cases as well, Jack the Ripper, D.B. Cooper, and now JonBenet Ramsey. But Time Theory's question is, maybe it's a ridiculous question, but I'll ask. Basically, it's a what if or hypothetical. So here it goes. If you were confronted by a stranger that knew 100% who the Zodiac was, and they put a gun to your head, and told you to guess who it was among every known suspect or person of interest thus far, which would you pick? Basically, your life would depend on it. If you got it right, you lived. If you got it wrong, then not. No answer is not an option. Which suspect do you think would give you a better shot at living? Of course, it could be someone still unknown at this point, or maybe not. I know that you don't have any certainty, but I'm curious what your answer would be. And Time Theory, I really appreciate how you took out all of the escape ropes and all of the loopholes out of this question. And, of course, I would say something like, oh, well, I don't have a suspect, or I'm not completely convinced that any person of interest actually was the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s, but you took all of those options off the table. So when I'm faced with a challenge question like this, what I like to do is really try to get into the mindset of imagining that someone is actually confronting me, holding the gun to my head, and asking this question: who was the Zodiac Killer? If you get it right, you live, and if you get it wrong, you die. But because this is a hypothetical, this person does have certainty that they know the Zodiac Killer. And as I was getting lost in my imagination, as I frequently do, I would say Arthur Lee Allen. Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect, only because we have so much information about him. And some of you might find that surprising coming from me, because I included Arthur Lee Allen in my debunking series, because I gave Arthur Lee Allen about a 5 out of 10, which is just a medium-level suspect rating, but that's who I would say simply because he was the prime suspect, was looked at heavily by law enforcement. There are reasons why people suspect him of being the Zodiac Killer. The accusations are not baseless. I just think that there's contradictory evidence, which I've gone through in other episodes, and there's Zodiac Killer suspects that I've given higher suspect ratings to, but that wasn't the challenge question. That wasn't who do you think is, someone who you can arrange in an interpretation of the evidence that makes sense to you. It said, if you had a gun to your head, what would you say? And that's my answer. And I even found that I was a little bit surprised, but that's what happens when you really try and get to the heart of these challenge questions, and that's one of the reasons why I like them. And the next challenge question comes to us from Eddie McNamara, who is the author of the set of stories called Two Fair Zone. And he responded to something that I had shared on a recent Zodiac Monday, and you guys know that I frequently talk about a Zodiac Killer book that I do not like too much, called The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up, also known as The Silence Badge by Lyndon Lafferty, and perhaps I said something to the effect of, it's the worst Zodiac Killer book that was ever written. It looks at William Joseph Grant as a Zodiac Killer suspect. And I'm sure I've uttered those words at some point on this channel, but let's be very clear. Let's be very clear. It's almost impossible to pinpoint one Zodiac Killer book and say that it is the absolute worst. It's just up there with the worst, or I should say down there with the worst. And Eddie McNamara responded to me by saying, all right, if you're going to say that that book is the worst or down there with the worst, what would you say is the best Zodiac Killer book that's ever been written? Now, I'm going to answer that, but I want to start from the bottom and work the way to the top. I frequently talk to you guys about how I don't like the book, The Zodiac Killer Cover-Up, and I have a two-part book discussion about it here on Black Box Online Radio. On the Wednesday show, I briefly mentioned another book that I thought was down there with the worst, called Unsolved Murders, The Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper by Patrick Auerbach, and they're for very different reasons. The Lyndon Lafferty book tells a bunch of wild stories that Lyndon Lafferty couldn't possibly know, recreating conversations that he wasn't present for, having information that he wouldn't have been privy to, as well as mixing around all types of dates and presenting himself as an on-the-ground member of law enforcement who was following the case for 35 years, and he's getting all of this information wrong and using this information, like the incorrect dates, as a way to create some type of set of Zodiac Killer signatures. In short, that book is phony baloney, but it's mostly presented as nonfiction with the exception of one or two chapters, which are labeled as what? Fiction. So very odd choices for Lyndon Lafferty, let alone that he even based on the premise that the Zodiac Killer was somebody named William Joseph Grant who had a connection to a Superior Court judge, and this judge issued an order that William Joseph Grant is not to be investigated. And it appears, I mean, one lawyer who follows this show even wrote out in the comments section, a Superior Court judge does not even have the authority to do that. He's making it up. So that book is filled with a bunch of very false information. Unsolved Murders, The Zodiac Killer, and Jack the Ripper by Patrick Auerbach is a set of suspect profile comments, just like pulling up the most famous Zodiac Killer suspects and writing like a couple paragraphs about each one, not an ounce of depth, not really getting under the surface at all, yet for some reason it's published in a book. And there is one that I will add for one of the worst Zodiac Killer books ever, and it's On the Trail of the Zodiac Killer by Francis J. Armstrong. This book is 85% summary. It's just summarizing the facts of the case, and doing so in a very bland and superficial way as well. But this is also the book that says that Jack the Ripper is a possible Zodiac Killer suspect, I kid thee not. The exact way that it's phrased is that some people say that Jack the Ripper was the Zodiac Killer and went after victims in California with one last hoorah. And I'm like, really, Francis J. Armstrong? Really? Who says that? Where did you get that information? Jack the Ripper operated in 1888 and the Zodiac Killer operated in 1968 and 69. Even if you're going to go with one of the younger suspects out there, such as, let's just say, Andrew John Gibson, who was 20 years old at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. 80 years into the future, he would have been 100 years old, 99 years old at the time of the Zodiac murders. And no, Andrew John Gibson actually passed away in the early 1950s. He's just one of the younger Jack the Ripper suspects that just came to mind. Again, I don't know where that's coming from, and I don't think anyone actually says that. It's a ridiculous statement, and it's a book that does not appear to be thoroughly researched or well presented at all. Excuse me for being harsh. I just wanted to be clear that Lyndon Lafferty's book might not be the worst. It's just among several of the worst. Now, this is a very good question. What is the best Zodiac Killer book out there? I'm also not going to choose a specific answer, and you want to know why? Because someone doesn't have a gun to my head, so I have these little escape ropes and loopholes. And the honest answer is there are different Zodiac Killer books that we're going to be attracted to for different reasons. For example, if you want to talk about cultural impact, if you want to talk about the book that just made the largest splash in the true crime world that's related to the Zodiac, absolutely it has to be Robert Graysmith's 1986 Zodiac book. I am very critical of Robert Graysmith. I completely accept that book is full of fabrications, but in terms of the influence that it had on people, Zodiac from 1986. If you want to talk about a book that has lots of original ideas, if you want to talk about one that is exploring the case in a different way, where someone is really trying very hard to understand the Zodiac Killer's behaviors, as well as looking at factual assertions and interpretations of the evidence that are coming at this with reasons and evidence and facts, absolutely Michael Cole's Zodiac Revisited trilogy. I think that it's very thoughtful. Contrary to those first three books that I mentioned, this is one where Michael Cole really tried to explore the case in a different way, sharing what he genuinely thinks, and also providing interpretations of the evidence that are defendable. I might not agree with all of his conclusions, but we're not going to. We're different people. If you want to talk about a Zodiac Killer book that is very personal, there is Obsessed by Mark Hewitt. Obsessed, My Relentless Pursuit of the Zodiac Killer, because that is a true crime memoir about how someone became fascinated with the Zodiac Killer mystery, and that's exactly what it's trying to do. He's telling about all of these different stories along the way as he became more and more engrossed and ingrained in the true crime world. So there are different books that we're going to find for different reasons. I mean, I've frequently talked to you guys about the Soleil Productions graphic novel. I think that that is an excellent visual presentation about what the Zodiac Killer would look like in a book. Again, very theoretical. It's not like they can actually show you what the Zodiac Killer's bedroom looks like, but that's a graphic novel, I repeat, novel. They're trying to tell a story. They're also recreating the conversations of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, the victims at the Lake Herman Road murders. So that is one where, I mean, they're not exactly trying to say, hey, this is some perfect work of nonfiction. It is meant to be a novel, but there's also a lot of very careful thought that went into that one. But you can respond in the comment section down below. Is there another Zodiac Killer book out there that you think is the worst or that you think is the best? And I just wanted to give my take on the subject because I received this challenge question. I have to give a second shout out to Eddie McNamara because he also shared something with me that was relevant to the Zodiac Killer's Lake Berryessa stabbing. On September 27th of 1969, the Zodiac Killer approached Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa. He wore a hooded costume, he carried a gun but did not use it, he carried a knife and pre-cut lengths of rope, he held the victims up at gunpoint but then he tied them up and stabbed them. And recently we've been talking about several inspirations for the Zodiac Killer's activities at Lake Berryessa. Why did he only wear the hooded costume one time? Why did he only use the knife one time? And Eddie McNamara shared a photo with me that says, I wonder if the Lake Berryessa hood was influenced by IRA members. That's the Irish Republican Army. In the late 1960s, they had a degree of popularity in the U.S. amongst the radical fringe leftists and Irish immigrants. And he is also talking about a new video that came out about a week and a half ago on the channel Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, and I will be discussing the Lake Berryessa hood influences in just a second there, but he responded to that one by saying that Ross Geraci mentioned this on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, that Ned Kelly is a possible influence, but the timing for the IRA was contemporary to the Zodiac attacks. Now this here, as you see, is a very similar black mask to the IRA. Now, did the Zodiac Killer have some type of connection to an Irish background, some type of connection to, say, the Celtic cross, perhaps? All of these are reasonable possibilities. I mean, I can see some similarities here, and also this would be just something that you would have to see in a newspaper. Oh, hey, look, a black hood. That gives me an idea for a hooded costume. Of course, the Zodiac Killer's hooded costume would be rather different. It would have clip-on sunglasses as well as a circle with a cross going through it. Again, possibly a Celtic cross, possibly a gun sight in the center. And the reason why I want to tie this back into Ross's presentation on Mysteries with Mr. Belgique is it is one of the best Zodiac Killer videos that I have seen in a while. I watched it last week, and then I decided to watch it again for a second time because it was just so full of pieces of information. It was just jam-packed with theories and ideas and research, and I really give credit to Ross Geraci of Planet X Filmworks for making that presentation. The first one that we should talk about is a set of armor that was worn by the Australian outlaw Ned Kelly, and that's what Eddie McNamara was referencing. And this is a roughly 97-pound set of armor that would have some type of similarity to the layout of the Lake Berryessa hooded costume. And this could also be very relevant because I've talked to you guys many times about how I think that the Zodiac Killer was inspired by Jack the Ripper. Both of them were serial killers who wrote letters, allegedly, and they also both had very short reigns of terror or period of activity, both had 5 canonical victims, so many similarities. And no, Francis J. Armstrong, they were not the same person, and I don't think anyone actually believes that the Zodiac is some type of 100-year-old Englishman walking around. Well, we don't even know if Jack the Ripper was English, but the Zodiac was not over 100 years old. Excuse me if no one actually believes that. But one of the inspirations could have been Ned Kelly in the suit of armor. There's also an Australian SWAT team set of gear that seems rather similar to the Lake Berryessa hood. But some of the things that Ross shared in his presentation were a film called Daredevils of the Red Circle that features a hooded figure who is holding a pistol, and this is very important because Zodiac wore the hooded costume and he carried the pistol, but he did not use it. I think the choice to carry a pistol at Lake Berryessa was really done for practical purposes. I mean, no matter how intimidating he looked in his hooded costume, he would not have been able to control the situation as well only with a knife and pre-cut lengths of rope, saying something to the effect of, hey, if you run, I'll run after you and I'll stab you. by using the gun, he was able to control the situation. It reminds me of a line from the movie The Devil's Rejects, where one character says that the gun is all about mind power. And that's exactly what the Zodiac was doing at Lake Berryessa. No matter what reason or what influence chose him to behave that way, he was carrying the gun because it was about mind power. It's about controlling the victims. He's also putting on this ruse where he's telling them the story that I'm an escaped convict. I was in Deer Lodge prison in Montana. I killed a guard. I'm just trying to get to Mexico. Pure ruse to the best of our knowledge, because the Zodiac certainly didn't go to Mexico. Instead, he's saying something to try and control the victims. Once again, all about mind power. And that's what the Zodiac Killer is about. The Zodiac was all about mind power. That was the reason why he was trying to commit these crimes, to have mind power and influence over the people of the San Francisco Bay Area, then ultimately the nation, and ultimately the world. But there are multiple depictions of this hooded character in Daredevils of the Red Circle that is carrying a pistol. And I think that this is also very relevant to the Zodiac's personality, because the Zodiac isn't just pulling these ideas out of his imagination. Very clearly, we have seen definitive cases where the Zodiac is referencing pieces of literature, comic books, movies. I mean, the Zodiac wrote something called The Exorcist Letter, where he says, I saw and think The Exorcist was the best satirical comedy ever. The Zodiac is making a direct attempt to show us that these ideas are borrowed from movies, comic books, literature, musicals. The Zodiac also directly quotes the Mikado from Gilbert and Sullivan. It seems pretty clear that he was quoting the Tim Holt comics with the Wheel of Death. It also seems like he was directly quoting the most dangerous game, the most dangerous animal of all, and such. So why is it so far to believe that he was influenced by something called Daredevils of the Red Circle, where he's trying to turn himself into some type of comic book villain? And the next thing that Ross shared in his presentation was something from Detective Magazine, where there's a letter that says "too bad," and it's actually signed with a circle cross sign-off. Again, very similar to the Zodiac Killer's logo. And this one has been featured on Tappa Talk in the past, but it's the first time that I've talked about it here on Black Box Online Radio. So, as you see, there are some very striking similarities among all of these things. Which one was the exact reference that the Zodiac was using? Well, I will openly admit that I don't know, because this is part of the unsolved mystery. Until we learn the Zodiac's identity, we might not directly know some things about his choices to wear the Lake Berryessa costume and carry the gun, but not use it, and commit only one crime by knife, only one crime by rope to the best of our knowledge. But there is somebody out there who wrote a really interesting book that I wanted to explore on Black Box Online Radio, and her name is Allison Kinney, and I contacted her last year and asked if she would be a guest on the show, and I didn't get a response. But so I decided to reach out to her again. And Allison Kinney is the author of the book Hood, and it tells the story of the evolution of hooded costumes. And I said story because some of it is historical, but there are also paranormal elements that are discussed. There's a very big section on the Grim Reaper and the hooded costume worn by the Grim Reaper. And then what she will do is she'll talk about the hoods that were worn by the Ku Klux Klan, also the Spanish costumes, and then ultimately look at how these are tied into hooded sweatshirts. It really is on the evolution of hooded costumes and hooded garments that are worn by people, and I just thought it's a very interesting subject for a book. And the reason why I contacted her was I was like, okay, this person has written a book on the evolution of hooded costumes. I was just more or less asking, hey, look, here's the Zodiac Killer's Lake Berryessa hood. I know you don't talk about this one directly in your book, but I would love to know your take on this. Do you have any observations about this? And I got this response. And she writes as follows. Hi, Ned. Thanks for your message and the invitation, but for the past year I've been absolutely swamped by my next projects, so I've sworn off all media. In the meantime, about the Zodiac Killer, it's not something I've studied, but if I had to guess, I'd guess that the costume was influenced by the kind of shaggy medievalism I talked about in my first chapter, where the fictionalized medieval carries an aura of violence that's supposed to be separate from and scarier than the modern. Like maybe he dressed up as a popular fictionalized image of an executioner, gun target, Rosicrucian crusader, whatever, not because those particular images have basis in history, but because their scary suggestiveness in the present. It doesn't have to be real to suggest a kind of ritualized violence outside the bounds of so-called modernity. We make it real by the popular acceptance of those images. I appreciate your request for an interview, though, and wish you the best of luck with your program. All the best, Allison Kinney. All right, so let's slow down there for a second. Let's take this off of boil, and let's go down to simmer. What is she trying to say with that giant paragraph of words? He was trying to be scary. I think absolutely everything that she said in that email just comes down to the fact that this primarily had a practical purpose. Remember, serial killers can have two major functions for wearing a mask. One is signature, and one is MO. With the Zodiac Killer, it's both. I don't even think that's open to discussion. Yes, he has a signature on it, but he's also using it to conceal his identity. And it seems like what Allison Kinney is trying to say is, just from really briefly glancing at the Zodiac Killer, the image is of the Lake Berryessa hood that are easily available online. It seems like he's doing this to be intimidating, to drive fear into the victims, as well as to control the situation, because they're going to associate the image of the Lake Berryessa hood with something like a dark and powerful figure, or a dark and mysterious figure, because they don't necessarily know what he's going to do. Maybe it's resembling an executioner's hood, maybe it's resembling a comic book villain, but it's something that they're not going to mistake this for just being some type of ordinary groundskeeper at Lake Berryessa. They're not going to mistake this for a park ranger. Instead, they're going to recognize this person is terrifying for the following reason. He is definitely posing as a threat to us. So I think that's what she means from her message there. One more time, Allison Kinney, author of the book Hood. And right now, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. Anybody can support this channel with buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out here on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. And Batman66 is also the person who provided me with a copy of the Time Life Collective, a book that I've used to talk about here on Zodiac Monday. But the Time Life Collective had multiple volumes. One of them covers the stories of serial killers, and these stories are being worked into the YouTube shorts. That's right, we have a return of the shorts on Black Box Online Radio. Monday through Friday, I release short episodes that are going to be talking about true crime, mostly serial killers, but any subject under the sun or in the darkness is fair game. Thank you to Batman66 once again. And our next one comes to us from CZ Guy. CZ Guy has become a regular and consistent supporter. Thank you so much. I appreciate absolutely everything from you. And then we have Tori C. Tori C is using the super thanks here on YouTube. That's another way to contribute. And once again, that is all greatly appreciated. You can use buymeacoffee.com, the super thanks, or the super chats for the live streams. And every Tuesday and Thursday I'm going live for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. It is a general discussion show, mostly focused on criminology, forensics, and criminal psychology. And I want it to be done that way because I want people to be able to ask any question they want. If somebody has a question about the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, or D.B. Cooper, or JonBenet Ramsey, then they can work them into the episodes. And True Crime Talk Radio in the morning will be coming to you every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, right now, I would also like to give a very big shout out to Stuart McAdam, who runs paidadvertisinghelp.com. Stuart has been a long-time supporter of this program, and I've also been a guest on Stuart's YouTube channel, which he runs, and last year, actually, oh goodness, this was in 2023. The years just go by. I mean, the blink of an eye, it's almost like 2 years just went in a flash. I guess that's what happens when you get older. But I was a guest on Stuart's program doing a two-part interview where we talked about the Zodiac Killer, as well as just running a YouTube channel, what is the experience like, and you can find all about Stuart's business at paidadvertisinghelp.com. But if you go down to the quick reference where I've posted the timestamps, you will also find a link to Stuart's channel where we did the interview. And I really thank Stuart McAdam for everything and all his support. And I should point out that I've interviewed Stuart 2 times for Black Box Online Radio. One time we were talking about the Zodiac Killer, and another time we were talking about D.B. Cooper, another mystery that we both follow. And our next one comes to us on buymeacoffee.com from Classic Chevy Cat. Classic Chevy Cat says, as I was listening to your latest Zodiac, I began to wonder if the Zodiac was a drunk, not when he did his thing, too precise for a hammered man to perform. Maybe afterwards or while plotting, or some other type of drug. Any thoughts on that? Absolutely, I've had thoughts on that. You know, it's really interesting that Classic Chevy Cat would ask that, because one of the very first videos that I ever watched about the Zodiac Killer was back in 2011, and was part of a documentary where it was featuring some people meeting up at Lake Berryessa, and they were talking about, well, the Zodiac Killer mystery, and someone said that they thought the Zodiac committed the crime on liquid courage. Now, as Classic Chevy Cat said, not hammered. Absolutely, it doesn't appear that the Zodiac was kind of like a bumbling mess, or he was so belligerent that he must have been intoxicated, like at a .4 level. No, absolutely not. Instead, this seems like somebody who may have taken something to get the edge off. And later on, I mean, well, first I should say that I thought it was a very bizarre statement that somebody would think that the Lake Berryessa stabbing was committed while the person had been drinking, because it seems like the Zodiac is in complete control and he's not giving away any signs of intoxication, and his hands are shaking, but he says that that's due to nervousness. But something like maybe having one drink beforehand, sure, because as I recall, they did find a beer bottle that was somewhere near the Lake Berryessa crime scene. But one person who has actually looked at this in very great detail is Vincent McConnell, and Vincent McConnell runs the New Cokes 2024 channel. And he's talked a lot about how he believes that the Zodiac Killer was experiencing drug-induced psychosis when he was composing certain things in his letters and certain things in the ciphers, and Vincent has some reasons for that, why he is making these observations, but it's definitely been discussed. Now, as far as being a drunk, I mean, the Zodiac seems like a very solitary individual, so I am perhaps going to have to give two possibilities. I don't even think the Zodiac would have been an occasional drinker. He was probably someone who did not drink at all, absolutely zero, or he was someone who had perhaps a pretty strong alcohol habit, not an alcoholic, not the kind of person that's going to get drunk all day, every day, or even the person who's going to get drunk 5 days a week. I think the Zodiac knew how to turn it off and knew how to turn it on. Especially a lot of people who live solitary lifestyles will turn to drugs and alcohol as a way to just provide some type of excitement and stimulation. Bear in mind that in 1969, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have streaming services. Entertainment took place in different forms. So getting drunk and listening to the Mikado, absolutely, I think that could fall in line with the Zodiac Killer's personality. Thank you, Classic Chevy Cat. And our next one comes to us on buymeacoffee.com from Michael G. And Michael G says, "Hi Ned, I wanted to show my support. I thought buying you a coffee would be a great start. You've inspired me to make my own YouTube channel, and a few others that are currently working on the project titled The People vs. Arthur Lee Allen, a working title that will hopefully make a splash. In the course of my research, I've come across some old forum posts by Tom Voigt about Arthur Lee Allen that, if are accurate, are very incriminating. I've contacted Mr. Voigt about them, and he stands by all of his comments to this day. The most intriguing is when he says that he has seen a Hall of Justice report that stated that Arthur Lee Allen was found to be in possession of size 10.5 wing walkers, the same boot prints at Lake Berryessa. There could be an innocent explanation for this, as his shoe size was 10.5, and these were issued to Navy personnel, including those who weren't actually involved with planes, although it had been over a decade since he had been active in the Navy. I wanted to get your thoughts on this, as I don't think Voigt would make something like this up out of thin air, and he didn't backpedal at all when I asked him about it last week. All the best, Michael from Iowa." And Michael G., we will look out for your channel and your episodes, The People versus Arthur Lee Allen. I would absolutely like to explore that material. And, I mean, Arthur Lee Allen owning wing walkers. All right, so we have this very big divide. I said Arthur Lee Allen gets a 5 out of 10 as a suspect rating. On the one hand, the Zodiac were 10.5 wing walkers at Lake Berryessa, right? Well, if Arthur Lee Allen is in possession of them, doesn't that mean he's an extremely strong Zodiac Killer suspect? Wing walkers were not only used by people who walked on the wings of airplanes. Wing walkers were even sold at military surplus stores, not to mention that we have the naval base at Mare Island, we have Travis Air Force Base. There are so many military installations in Northern California. Countless people could have been wearing wing walkers. So that doesn't necessarily mean that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer, and I'm sure that any defense attorney would dismantle that argument, put forward in a court of law that, oh, well, he owned wing walkers and he has a size 10.5 shoe. Well, lots of people are a size 10.5. I am actually a size 10.5. And here's the interesting thing. I'm 5'8". Arthur Lee Allen was 6 feet tall. So that goes to show you about the height discrepancies. It seems normal to me for a 5'8" person to wear a size 10.5 shoe. And apparently a 6 foot tall person was also wearing a size 10.5. So I think that that is not damning evidence enough, but I would absolutely love to see your video and your channel on the people versus Arthur Lee Allen. And lastly, we have a shout out going to C.G. Karras, also known as Carl. C.G. Karras left this in the form of a super thanks here on YouTube, and I did a book discussion on the book by C.G. Karras called Zodiac, Murderers and Histories, Ciphers and Crimes, which I invite you guys to check out, and that is available here on Black Box Online Radio. And I also want to talk to you guys about the future of the channel and the updates. I've recently launched the channel membership, which will give people access to bonus content, and you'll get a second episode about D.B. Cooper, as well as a second episode about Jack the Ripper, and that was the original brainchild of the channel membership. And the feedback that I've received from you guys is that people are saying, even if they are daily listeners to Black Box Online Radio, it's actually been somewhat of a challenge to watch 2 episodes a day. Make no mistake, there was absolutely enough material about Jack the Ripper to do the double event, 2 episodes on Wednesdays, but listeners who are trying to keep up with every episode of the show are finding that it's going to be a little bit troubling. So firstly, with the D.B. Cooper episodes, I will be moving the Cooper profile to Sundays, and that will be a blend of live streams as well as just releasing episodes like this one in the podcast format. And you can check that one out on Sundays. You can join the channel membership. But next week's episode should just be coming out free to everyone as another apology for last week's True Crime Talk Radio. True Crime Talk Radio in the morning is going to be coming to you every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I had everything all set up and ready to go, and for some reason the computer just crashed, so I ended up doing it on my phone, which had a very lackluster presentation, or a presentation that I wasn't satisfied with, so I decided to give a free episode of the Cooper profile on Friday, and there'll be another one coming out on Sunday to all of you who are curious about the D.B. Cooper case. And really, with the Jack the Ripper episodes, it's possible to consolidate them into one episode, because that's the original concept of Black Box Online Radio. I'm really getting back to the way that this channel was created. When I started BBO War in 2017, I wanted this to be a daily segment, 7 days a week, and just putting out 1 episode a day. It was my daily YouTube segment, and now I would have the ability to do that in a way that I think is going to really just try to connect with you guys in a larger way, and connect with you guys in a more direct way, as opposed to just talking about absolutely anything, focusing on these unsolved mysteries that we've really become fascinated with. And on that note, I have to give a very big thank you to everyone who listened to the recent episode on JonBenet Ramsey. And this one came out on Saturday. So many great comments. I could do a 2-hour Q&A session just responding to all of your comments about JonBenet Ramsey that were left on this channel. But for last week's Ripper Wednesday, again talking about Jack the Ripper, I did a book discussion on Zodiac the Ripper by Paul Christian. And this book, hence the name, is looking at some things that I've talked about a lot on the channel. Was the Zodiac Killer directly inspired by Jack the Ripper, the serial killer from 1888? And no, Francis J. Armstrong, they weren't the same person. I said that 3 times in this episode, because I'm not going to lie to you guys, that is a really dumb idea. I will move on. Okay, but what this book is actually proposing is, how do we solve the Zodiac Killer mystery? We can look at suspect profiles, we can consider persons of interest, but how do we actually find the right person? And this book proposes something. If you didn't hear last week's Whipper Wednesday, I'm going to give you a 1-minute breakdown. This book says that, almost certainly, the Zodiac was familiar with Jack the Ripper, for all the reasons that I listed off at the beginning. So what are we going to do? What do we need to do? We need to find out who was reading Jack the Ripper content in 1968 and 69, like going to libraries, looking at who was checking out books on Jack the Ripper, looking at magazine subscriptions, if those records exist, who was subscribing to magazines that had content about Jack the Ripper. And let's use this as a paper trail to find the Zodiac Killer. Alright, so I absolutely appreciate the original thought. I absolutely appreciate the original thinking. I really think that it's a very interesting avenue to explore. It's one that I hadn't thought of in the past. I give credit to Paul Christian for trying to do something different, as opposed to just combing through records and finding somebody who resembles the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch. But is this a practical way to find the Zodiac Killer? I just don't think it's possible. And maybe if you had a book that was checked out 10 times by one person about Jack the Ripper from some type of library in Benicia or Vallejo or Petaluma, then you could track that person down. But firstly, I'm not even sure that records like that would exist in the 21st century. Secondarily, things like magazine subscriptions, I really think that that would be a hit or miss thing, because the records were not preserved electronically in 1968 and 69. We didn't really have these types of computerized archives until way later, and it really just would depend on whether or not the companies chose to keep electronic records of their old papers. So I think that this is something that is, very, very thoughtful, but at the same time, I'm not sure if this is the most practical avenue. And we also have to remember the possibility that maybe the Zodiac Killer just had a similar psychological background to Jack the Ripper, and that's why this type of arrogant persona was created. And I mean, so what do you guys think? Do you think that that is a practical way to try and find the Zodiac Killer, by saying that the Zodiac was directly inspired by Jack the Ripper, therefore we need to find out who was reading Jack the Ripper related materials in 1968 and 69, as well as the years before? Let me know in the comment section down below. And because this is the Zodiac Killer news report, I would like to let you guys know about some new Zodiac Killer content that is out. There is a new video on the channel Real Zodiac Killer Revealed, that's RZKR, and it's called In Zodiac's Handwriting on Bohemian Club Photo, and that is of course talking about a possible handwriting sample that's matched to the suspect John Parr Cox. And there is a new set of Zodiac Killer videos that is available on the channel SoCal Phantoms. That's SoCalFanThumbs, SoCal Phantoms. And if you're again, just someone who wants to hear different perspectives on the Zodiac Killer mystery, I invite you to check them out. And right now I would like to look at a new piece of information that I haven't examined before on the Zodiac Killer news report, and this is an article called How the Zodiac Killer Investigation Fell Apart in 1978 Because of Armistead Maupin. And I would like to give a shout out to the Zodiac Killer and Me group for sharing this article. It was written by KQED. And let's have a read. In 1978, San Francisco was an anarchic place to be. A burgeoning punk scene was in the process of eviscerating the city's reputation as a hippie haven. Civil rights campaigns ranged all over, including the Black Panthers. If that hadn't been a lot going on, it's possible that one very strange turn of events might have stayed in public consciousness for a bit longer. Because yes, it's almost bonkers as everything else that happened that year. In July of 1978, 9 years after the Zodiac Killer first struck, one of the most prominent homicide cops working the case was suddenly removed from his post. By that time, Inspector David Toschi, who had been on the case since day one, is said to have interviewed 5,000 people and examined more than 2,000 suspects. So it's probable that his sudden transfer from homicide, in Toschi's own words, to pawn shop detail was always going to make some headlines. The reason it blew up citywide is because of gossip and the person responsible for his demotion, the author of Tales of the City, a San Francisco man named Armistead Maupin. The whole thing started in 1976 when Maupin consulted Toschi so that he might better write the character of homicide detective Henry Tandy. Tandy was featured in Maupin's San Francisco column and the first book in a series called Tales of the City that combined many of these stories. True to Maupin's tendency to blend fiction and reality, Toschi was also written as Tandy's mentor. And Dave Toschi, of course, has been featured as an influence or character in other works, and I should say he is a real person who influenced certain fictional characters, most notably Dirty Harry, played by Clint Eastwood, and the character from Bullitt, played by Steve McQueen. All very normal and fine so far. Well, yes, but not for long. According to Armistead Maupin, within the first week of Toschi's name appearing in Tales of the City, the author received 2 fake fan letters that included praise for Dave Toschi. Maupin clocked the notes as phony. Only some weeks later, and even more arrived, at which point he suspected that Dave Toschi was sending them himself. Maupin later stated that he regarded the letters as harmless, if somewhat reckless, action on the part of the police officer. He also told the San Francisco Examiner, "I was extremely embarrassed for him. The letters were so transparent, so pathetic that I couldn't bring myself to confront them." And I really do have to say something very honest right there. If Dave Toschi was even just sending in his own fake fan letters, yeah, I can see where Armistead was coming from, because this is just stating that it is a pathetic thing to do. But to provide some other background information, the way that I've heard this story in the past is that Dave Toschi was doing this as a game that he was playing with his family, just to see if he could get mentioned in the paper more frequently. So while this might seem like a pathetic thing to do, this is also just a family having a laugh. Should he have done that? No, he should not have, but there are a few blended reasons why Toschi was doing this. At the same time he was sending the fake letters, Toschi was also sending Mopin some unusual packages, signed directly from himself. These included one containing a signed photograph of himself posing with the Streets of San Francisco actor Carl Malden, and another containing a calendar. Herb Caen also reportedly received one of these calendars. Things escalated in April of 1978. After a 4-year period of silence from the Zodiac, a new letter purporting to be from the serial killer arrived at the Chronicle's office. It read in part, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I am back with you. Tell Herb Caen I am here. I have always been here. That city pig Toschi is good, but I am smarter and better, and he will get tired than leave me alone." After Mopin saw the letter, he began to suspect that Toschi might have faked it. For one, no prior Zodiac letters had ever mentioned an individual police officer. In addition, Mopin thought that the tone of the margin stops and the shape of the D's in the Zodiac letter looked similar to the ones he saw in Toschi's fabricated fan mail. Mopin was concerned enough that he contacted Toschi's superiors at the San Francisco Police Department, and they immediately launched an investigation into Toschi publicly, and Toschi admitted to sending fake fan letters to Armistead Mopin, and he was quickly removed from the Zodiac case. Okay. He may have admitted to those, but he did not admit to writing the 1978 letter. Let's be very clear about that. He admitted to the fan letters. It was a foolish thing to do, he said at the time. I am ashamed of it. However, Toschi also denied meddling in the Zodiac case. I wrote no Zodiac letter. I don't need another Zodiac letter. It brings me a ton of extra work. In the same interview, Toschi dismissed Mopin's suspicions as baseless publicity, a stunt that was specifically timed to coincide with the release of the first Tales of the City book. And just on a side note, Tales of the City is a series of books written by Armistead Mopin, and it was turned into a TV series in 1993, and then it was later recreated on Netflix. The 1993 version is available here on YouTube for free, and I plan on watching it very soon. However, I don't, this enters a point where both things can be true. Did Armistead Mopin actually suspect Dave Toschi of writing the 1978 letter? It seems like it. Did he want publicity for his new series of books coming out? It seems like it. Both of these can be true, and that doesn't necessarily mean that Armistead Mopin is purely malicious. Instead, it just means he has a single self-serving reason for why he did what he did. Asked what the lowest point of the controversy was for Toschi, and he explained, "Someone from Internal Affairs asked me where I had been on the night that Zodiac murdered Paul Stein. I told him I was home in bed, but I got sick to my stomach. Apparently some reporter had asked, could Dave Toschi be the Zodiac? You'll never know how much that hurt." No, absolutely, I don't think that Dave Toschi was the Zodiac. I mean, he certainly doesn't match the physical descriptions. He seems to have had very different hair than what is reported from the Zodiac in all of the composites as well as the witness sightings, not to mention the fact that just because someone gets accused of writing a letter in 1978, does that mean that they actually murdered anybody in 1969? No, absolutely not. I'm going to give you guys my very honest take on the subject. I don't necessarily find this explanation about how Toschi fabricated the letter, or I don't find Toschi's explanation of, I would never fabricate a letter. It brings me extra paperwork. It brings me more work to do. I wouldn't have done that. I don't find that to be very convincing. Now, I completely am aware that they conducted an internal affairs investigation, and they determined that Toschi didn't write the letter. He was cleared of this, and I have to accept that. So I am stuck between the rock and the hard place of, it seems like there are reasons to say that Dave Toschi did not write the 1978 letter, but I still think that he did it. Am I wrong? I don't know. If I had to bet my life on it now, or as time theory would say, if I have a gun pointed to my head, and I have to give the correct answer, did Dave Toschi write the 1978 Zodiac letter? I would be like, yes. I mean, that's just what I would say in that particular situation. He has this history of fabricating other letters, trying to get his name mentioned in the paper. He's playing this game, and also, Also, I mean, he seems to have some similar handwriting that Armistead Maupin thought he recognized. He had interactions with Dave Toschi, so he could recognize his word choice, his syntax, the way he is structuring his letter. So I'm just kind of left with the feeling that Dave Toschi did write it. Now I know that there is contradictory evidence. They they either would have, you would have to say something to the effect of, all right, they conducted their investigation and they cleared him. If he did write the letter, they did that to save face, to make the department look good. They didn't want to bring any more negative light on the investigating officers of the Zodiac Killer mystery, or maybe he didn't actually do it. But you guys heard my hard stance. I'm forced to deal with this very strong ruling from the internal affairs, but also I still think that he did it. If you want to challenge me on that, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. Did Dave Toschi write the 1978 letter? And the final thing that I have for you here on the Zodiac Killer News Report is going to be talking about the DNA in the Zodiac Killer mystery. And this is one of the things that people are very disappointed with. How do we solve a true crime case? Well, we could look at Jack the Ripper related materials and find out who was reading them in 1968, and maybe that person used Jack the Ripper as a blueprint. That's a creative solution, but a lot of people are just asking the question, do we have the Zodiac Killer's DNA, fingerprints, palm prints, physical evidence that was left behind? I mean, even partial fingerprints could be left behind. Or how about ballistics, the firearms that were used in the murders? Could those not be in someone's attic somewhere? These are hard pieces of physical evidence that exist well beyond the paper trail. And a lot of people are really curious about what DNA sample was used in the past to make certain rulings. Because there are Zodiac Killer suspects, such as Arthur Lee Allen or Shel Cavalli, that were allegedly ruled out because of DNA evidence. And this was done on an ABC show called Prime Time. And this is often frequently misquoted as 2020. But as I understand, I mean, I used to watch this show back in the day. There was a very similar program that was created that was mostly hosted by Diane Sawyer called Prime Time. And I think I watched it on Thursday nights back in West Virginia. But, I mean, that's all beside the point. The focus of this is what sample were they using for the DNA? Because when I watch Zodiac videos on YouTube, I find all types of different responses about the origin of the DNA that was used. And I told you guys in the past that I was going to do a much larger presentation on this, but as they say, there is no time like the present. So let's look at an article that was written by ABC News. This is the one that I always cite and the first source that I go to. This is the official write-up for the show that aired in 2002, and the article was reprinted in 2006 and 2008. Will DNA solve the 1969 killings? To date, the San Francisco Police Department has only found a faint result in DNA testing on 3 envelopes newly discovered by Primetime, but the partial profile on one of the envelopes that was already in the department's files was the one containing the card that was sent on November 8th of 1969. So that's the one that has the partial DNA profile. And furthermore, the November 8th, 1969 envelope should have also contained the 340 cipher. So I just want to throw that out there. And this is going to be important because it's not the envelope exactly, it's the stamp. And let's keep reading. I found a partial DNA fingerprint from a male individual who at some time has had contact with the stamp, said Dr. Sidney Holt, the supervisor of the department's DNA lab. Investigators are working on the assumption that the man who licked the stamp was the Zodiac Killer. But as you just heard there, this is not saliva DNA. At the start of that quotation, they said very clearly, it is a fingerprint. And this is from the outside of the stamp. Holt found four out of a possible 9 DNA markers, plus an indicator of gender confirming that the killer was male. Well, if that is the Zodiac's DNA, how do we know that? It's not necessarily enough to positively identify anyone as the Zodiac, but it is enough to narrow suspicions, or perhaps even eliminate suspects, she said. Next, Holt compared the Zodiac DNA with samples provided by Primetime from 3 men who have been identified by amateur investigators as possible Zodiac candidates. Arthur Lee Allen, Shel Cavalli, and Charles Clifton Collins, who died in 1993, and they required a closer examination, but Holt was ultimately able to confirm that it did not match the DNA found on the envelope. Collins' son, William Collins, who had suspected a connection between the Zodiac Killer and his father when he saw the Zodiac's handwriting, was relieved. Not the guy, huh? This is a good thing in my life. While the Zodiac's partial DNA profile will enable the San Francisco Police Department to eliminate some of the possible suspects from the list, it will not be enough to confirm an identification. Solving the Zodiac killings will require more evidence. Well, if this is a DNA fingerprint from the stamp, how do we truly know that that's the Zodiac's? I mean, what I would hope is that they had some way of getting the DNA from the outside of the stamp and matching it to the inside of the stamp, if they could match the DNA fingerprint to the saliva. That isn't what they are saying, but they sound so confident in their DNA results. And I would hope that this would be an example of law enforcement withholding certain pieces of information and the media just loosely putting it out there, because otherwise, how else would we get closure in the Zodiac Killer mystery? Do I think the Zodiac is still out there? I want to believe that he is, and I actually do think that it's still out there, said Kelly Carroll, one of the investigators on the case. Although the Zodiac Killer hinted at suicide in his last confirmed letter in 1974, Carroll believes that he's possibly still alive. Once again, in 2002. That's, oh goodness, 23 years ago. So, I don't know if the Zodiac Killer is still alive to this day. And he would be in his 60s at the time, if he is alive. Again, 23 years ago. He would be in his 80s or 90s now. This is one step closer to catching him. Well, you guys have heard it there. The DNA might exist, it might not. It's all uncertain. To us in the general public, these DNA results are clouded with uncertainty. Is it even fair to say that we don't have the Zodiac Killer's DNA? For us in the general public, we have no reason to trust this. Touch DNA from the outside of the stamp on the November 8th, 1969 correspondence, and I always phrase it that way because it's the stamp and the envelope. And do you think that my suspicion is right, that maybe they have some other saliva DNA on the envelope that they're being intentionally vague about because they don't want to reveal everything, and then they've matched that to the DNA fingerprint? I mean, so they know that, like, this is the same person who handled it? I would hope so, but I don't have enough to say that with certainty. So I would love to know what you think about everything in this episode. What do you think about the possible inspirations for the Lake Berryessa costume? What do you think about all the possible influences? What do you think about the statement that the hood was primarily just used to terrify people as opposed to any type of historical significance? What do you think about my answer to the challenge question? If you had a gun to your head, which Zodiac Killer suspect would you choose? Do you believe that Dave Toschi fabricated the 1978 letter? And do you think they have the Zodiac Killer's DNA? Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and you also can get the show at blackboxned88 on Instagram. There are write-ups for the show available at zodiackillercode.com. Please check that out for the notes and the production assembly of this show, zodiackillercode.com. You can also visit some of the channels that I recommended, such as SoCal Phantoms. There is the link for Stuart McAdams' channel down below. Of course, Planet X Filmworks, Mysteries with Mr. Belgique, lots of Zodiac Killer content going around, and we're going to be looking out for more shows in the future. That is all for me now. Once again, I am your host, Black Box Ned, and good